Shalom. I suppose I can say Shabbat Shalom because I'm on the verge of Shabbat, and I just did my final Torah update for the four last readings of book of Exodus, because this week, God willing, I'll be traveling to the States for a 2-month lecture circuit, and coming back hopefully in Passover, before Passover, so I will renew the YouTubes, God willing, when I come back in April. And of course, the political update is still focusing on Secretary of State John Kerry. Martin Indyk also said some very important things. And what I want to do is review a few things from the political process. And I wanted to continue and complete the Shabbat reading because they're all really interconnected. It's interesting how things have not really changed very much in 3,000 or 3,500 years. The Haftorah reading, which is in continuation of Kitisa, which is next week's reading, comes from 1 Kings chapters 18 and 19. Very interesting reading about Elijah the prophet. And what we know here is that the king of Israel at the time, the king of Judea, was Ahab, and his wife was Jezebel. And they led the people of Israel astray. And instead of worshiping God and keeping God's commandments, they started to worship Baal, as they say in English in America, but in Hebrew, Baal. And they were worshiping the trees. I don't want to say Christmas trees, but the tradition of praying to trees goes back to the pagan times. And Jezebel actually murdered almost all of the prophets. Some of the prophets were hidden away, but really Elijah felt very lonely. And finally Elijah says, I'm going to confront King Ahab and Jezebel. And he goes up to Mount Carmel. And this is one of my favorite readings from the prophets. And he says to the 450 priests of Baal, he says, let's do a competition. We're going to take 2 cows, cut them up as a sacrifice to God. And Elijah says to the 450 priests of Baal, you guys go first. And I'll go afterwards. And as you all know, the 450 priests of Baal start incanting their gods, their trees, and their god Baal to accept their offering. And you have to understand, this is not just about making offerings. If your offering was not taken, you were going to be executed. And so the 450 priests of Baal started dancing and hollering and screaming, and finally, they actually started cutting themselves with knives until they were bleeding. And this is something we see today in Islam, in Shiite Islam. We see it in Lebanon, we see it in Iran, we see it in the Shiite communities, where to prove their loyalty to Allah, they cut themselves with knives. And God says in the Holy Torah, for the Jew and the Christian, you should not cut your body with knives. You should not use knives to cut your body. And so we see here a pagan tradition going all the way back to the times of ancient Israel, 3,000 years ago. And this week, now I'm going to do a little political update, which is connected with this. The Palestinians have, one of their leaders is Saeb Erekat. And Saeb Erekat was saying, my family goes back to the original Canaanites, the pagans, that the Israelites were commanded to wipe out and remove from the land. Otherwise, they would be a curse. And to this day, they are a curse. I mean, Secretary of State Kerry wants us to make peace with these pagan Canaanites. And, also I have to tell you, I'm a philatelist. I'm a stamp collector. And the Palestinian Authority has issued postage stamps of the ancient Canaanite idols. These people, they call themselves Muslims, that they're not pagans, and yet they praise the pagan tradition of pre-Islamic Canaan, and they used the pagan statues, the pagan religion, to show that they were here before Israel. So this is part of the update. We are supposed to be making peace with people who are sworn to our destruction. The U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff came to Israel right after the Six-Day War in 1968, and they said to Israel, you cannot defend the borders of June the 5th, 1967. And that all the U.S. governments since then, since 1967, have been saying to Israel, you must go back to the borders of 1967. In other words, the United States government is saying to Israel, commit suicide. So the first thing I wanted to say to my dear viewers, especially those in the NSA, FBI, CIA, State Department who may be watching this video, is that Israel is not going to go back to the borders of June the 5th, 1967. Israel is not going to withdraw from the Jordan River. Israel is not going to come down from half the Golan Heights that we still hold. And you know, we made a terrible mistake under Sharon and Olmert to withdraw from Gaza. Instead of getting peace, we got missiles. And if the Palestinians get more land, God forbid, we will be seeing more missiles. They will shut down our airports. They will shut down our country. And so if we made a mistake with Gaza in 2006, okay, 2005, we can say, well, you know, shame on them. But if we make the same mistake regarding Judea and Samaria, shame on us. One of the descriptions of insanity is when you keep making the same mistakes over and over again, thinking this time it's going to work. Secretary of State Kerry is not only asking, as Yuval Steinitz, one of our ministers, says, we cannot negotiate with a gun at our temples. And Secretary of State Kerry is putting a gun to our temples. And he says he's not threatening us with embargoes, but yes, he is. Just to mention it is a self-fulfilling prophecy. And you know, one of the things I used to like about George W. Bush is the bring it on. Bring it on, Kerry. Bring on these embargoes. I want to see the world try to embargo Israel. I want to see the world stick its finger in God's eye. And one of the things I learned, I'm a Jew, but one of the things I learned from the Christians, and I learned a lot from the Christians, is that in Zechariah 2 verse 12, it says that the Jews are the apple of God's eye. And anyone who touches the Jews touches the apple of God's eye. You know, I was born in the United States, and I love the United States. And believe it or not, I'm a patriotic Israeli, and I think it's fair to say I'm a patriotic American too. And I don't want to see any harm befall the United States of America. The United States of America, in my opinion, even today, even with the president it has today, America is the greatest country on earth. It is the greatest Christian country on earth. Christian means the Bible. America must not go against Israel. And by forcing Israel to make a suicide pact with the Palestinians, America is going against Israel. But you know, I'm one of those who believes that God is in control. You don't want to believe in God, then of course everything I'm saying is nonsense. But if you do believe in God, and I do believe in God, and there are many like me who believe in God, we may be the enemies of those who don't believe in God, but God settles all the scores, and vengeance is of God. Vengeance is not of me or of anyone here, it's from God. The Iranians have said, the Americans are trying to do peace with the Iranians. The Iranians have said, we have missiles that can hit the United States. We have missiles that can hit American bases in Turkey and in Europe, not just Israel. Iran can cause World War III. And I really, really request from the Russians to be very, very careful not to give Hezbollah. This is what we've been getting this week. The Russians are giving conventional and non-conventional weaponries to Hezbollah. Now, we're not against the Shiites. We're not against the Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria. And of course, one of the allies is Hezbollah. You know, we're not looking for trouble with Hezbollah. We're not looking for trouble with Bashar al-Assad. We're not looking for trouble with Iran. But the moment these countries that cut themselves in the head to show their loyalty to God, and they do what they do, the Sunnis do it to the Shiites, and the Shiites do it to the Sunnis. Islam is a form of insanity threatening not only the Jews, not only the Christians, not only the Hindus, not only the Buddhists, not only the blacks in Africa. Islam is a threat to the Muslims themselves. And so if Secretary of State Kerry and Martin Indyk say that Israel has to create a Palestinian state on the borders of June the 5th, 1967, and give them Jerusalem, the apple of God's eye, to an enemy that is sworn to wipe Israel off the face of the earth, to an enemy that refuses to recognize Israel, I believe in God's judgment. And we have to work very, very, very much for all Jews and all Christians. And you know what? Good Buddhists and good Hindus and good black people and good Muslims who don't want this horrible judgment to befall the Middle East or to befall America or to befall Russia. You know, the Russians also have their problem. I was on Radio Moscow in Russian in June of 1994, and I warned the Russians. I said to the Russians, America is not your enemy anymore. Europe is not your enemy anymore. Israel and the Jews are not your enemy anymore. It is Islam that has been fighting Russia for 1,000 years. The Russian Orthodox Church came to Russia in 995 AD in order to unify the Slavic tribes and expel the Turkish and Persian and all these other Islamic Tatars that came into Russia. Russia, US, Europe, Israel, Africa, Asia. Aren't you watching what's happening in China and Burma and Thailand and India? All these countries, they're not Christian or Jewish countries, and they're also having war with Islam. And Islam is having war with Islam because the Shiites are fighting the Sunnis and vice versa. The Shiites are fighting the Shiites and the Sunnis are fighting the Sunnis. Mr. Kerry, what peace are you talking about? And if the PLO, Abu Mazen, thinks he's going to make peace, of course they're going to kill him if he makes peace, but let's say he makes a peace agreement, Hamas will say no peace. And if Hamas makes peace with us, then the jihadists will say to Hamas, we're going to kill you, no peace with Israel. And if the jihadists make peace, then the Salafists will say no. So who are we making peace with? There's nobody to make peace with because there's no real address. And so I beg, this is my last YouTube for now, I beg Secretary of State Kerry to wake up and to realize the threat, not only to Israel, the Muslim Brotherhood backed by President Obama, threat to the United States, threat to the Middle East, threat to the Arab leaders themselves. And I wanted to conclude by saying, regarding the peace process with the Palestinians, I love the Palestinians. Israel loves the Palestinians. The only nation on earth that really loves the Palestinians are the Jews of Israel. We live with them, we work with them, we eat and we drink with them. I said this on Israeli national TV in October 2006, September 2006. There is no nation in the world that loves the Palestinians. We, Jews of Israel, genuinely love the Palestinians that live amongst us. And so true peace can only happen when the Palestinians live in peace under Jewish rule. God bless you.